Hello, good afternoon, everybody. Thank you very much for being here today in this webinar. I thank you all. I thank you, Donatella, for accepting this invitation. And it's very nice to see you and to see a lot of people here, virtually see a lot of people here in this session. And I also would like to thank you, Sofia Rocha from our office, the communication office of the Center for Research and Studies in Sociology here at Lisbon University Institute. Thank you for assisting us today. And as always, you assist us also in face-to-face seminars and now in virtual events. And before starting and give the floor to Donatella, I would like to spend some few words about the seminar series. The monthly seminar, Social Movements and Political Action, was created in 2014, so is now in its sixth year, and we are quite happy about this. We already had around 50 sessions, and I just would like to show the seminar page in the case you are interested in following more sessions, and this is our today's sessions. The previous sessions were still face-to-face until February, and after we had to cancel the seminar of March. We have been dealing with many different topics related to social movements, participations, and in different areas of the world. Also in Africa, which is usually an area also a little, especially sub-Saharan Africa, an understudied area. And the seminars take place both in English and in Portuguese. And so since the beginning of the pandemic, we decided to move on with webinar format. So in a certain way, we suspended the Planet program because of the reasons we all know, but also we wanted to take the opportunity to use this period to face some challenges, to respond to the challenges opened by this period, both in terms of really the possibility of continuing the seminar in these conditions, but also to give some reflections. Of course, many of our reflections in this moment are still ongoing, so they need more time to be consolidated, but to offer some first reflection on the situation and on the social movement's reaction to this situation. The first webinar in this context took place on the 16th of April, and it was this webinar, Stay Home Without Harm, on the right to housing in COVID lockdown times. We had many presentations from different parts of the world, Lebanon, United States, Italy, Portugal, Spain, Brazil, and you can also watch the webinar in. There is the video somewhere, but I can. You can look on our website, and there is also the video of the webinar, and also the webinar of the video of today's webinar will be there. So today presentation, today's seminar is in the session of today. We have the pleasure to have with us Donatella della Porta, and she will talk about how progressive social movements can save democracy in pandemic times. I'm sure that Donatella doesn't need long presentations. We all know very well her work and her contribution to social movement studies and democratic theory too. And but just I would like to mention something about her. You know that she's the director of the Cosmos, the Center on Social Movement Studies, and she's the author of many books and scientific articles, an incredible number of books and scientific articles related to these topics. And her more recent work just came out, and this is the monograph on social movements can save democracy, democratic innovations from below. And it is, I think, is in a perfect timeline for this discussion, and I think that is also very connected to the today's presentation and reflection. Before finally letting the floor to Donatella, I already talked too much, I think. Just would like to explain a little bit the format. So we have around 30 minutes of presentation, and after, in the meantime, if you would like to ask something or to give some comments on the presentation, you can write in the chat, please. And after I will try, and in the meantime, I will try to collect the comments and questions, and after to open the floor on this basis. I just would like to ask you to be try to be synthetic and short in these questions and comments, because it's a quite difficult job, at least for me. So now I think it's enough from my side. Just wanted to also say the next webinar will take place on the 24th of June, and we will have Anna Lindsay, and she will talk about mobilization around immigration detention and pandemic challenges for activism in UK detention setting. But for now, we have to really start our session of today. I'm really thrilled to listen to Donatella about this topic, and thank you very much for joining us. And you have the floor. Thank you.
Thank you, Guia, very much, and thank you for this invitation to this very interesting and successful seminar on social movements and collective action. This is, I think, my third presentation on the topic of pandemics and social movements, but what I realize is that things are changing so fast that also the visions of social movements in the pandemic tend to change. So if you can put up my PowerPoint presentation. Yes, Sophia is helping me because of some technical issues. I wanted to address now in this third step how social movements can save democracy in pandemic time, because my impression is that we moved from the very beginning of the pandemic with the questions about how can social movement address the challenge, into realizing that social movements are indeed mobilizing in different forms, also in lockdown, into seeing how now that we are exiting the lockdowns, also social movements adjust, but also are fueled by sort of critical consequences of the pandemic time. So in the next slide, I say, where did I start from? So Guia has cited this book which just came out, How Social Movement Can Save Democracy. And I thought when I finished this book, we were looking backward at how social movements had addressed a moment of deep crisis, especially in Southern Europe, the financial crisis and the effects of austerity policies. And in this book, I try to see especially the innovative characters of social movements, without at the time imagining that social movements have now to address the crisis of equal, if not higher, disruptiveness. So what I want to do in this presentation is to locate the analysis of social movements in pandemic time into a momentum visions of movements. So in the next slide, I try to summarize the way in which I want to look at the moment in which things are changing very quickly. So I just published an article on developing a momentous approach to social movements. And what I mean by this is that we are accustomed to look at social movements in normal time, which are times characterized by rules, by type of habituses, but social movements as we see them now are addressing another moment in time. A momentum in the sense of Newtonian mechanics is defined by the product of mass and velocity. And what I was struck about is the fact that more and more often social movements themselves use this term momentum to stress also the role of social movements as creating a crack, as producing drastic turning points through creating massive support, but also at great velocity. So in terms of neo-institutionalist approach, one could say it is not the time of gradual adaptations, it is rather the time of critical junctures. And in fact, I think that it is especially in this time that, as I show in the next slide, that social movements are carriers of emergent norms that address situations of fluidity. So already in past research, almost at the beginning of the history of social movement studies, social movements have been welcomed or at least addressed as actors that emerge especially as conventions cease to guide social action and people collectively transcend, bypass, or subvert established institutional patterns and structures. This is Turner and Killian in an old but influential piece. Also more recently, other scholars like Mark Bensinger have reflected on the contentious and potentially subversive practices that challenge normalized practices, modes of causation, or systems of authority. So movement are carriers of challenging code, to use Alberto Melucci definitions. And these emergent norms are all the more important in moments of crisis, which are potentially more moment of catharsis and change. So what we see nowadays, and I just tried to make a visual summary of it, is in the next slide, we see is the fact that the pandemic time has not stopped protest, but rather if we open any time or any type of communication means, online, offline, newspapers, alternatives, and so on, what we see is a huge amount of protests. There is protesting for public health. This is a picture that went viral of nurses in Phoenix standing up against the radical rights attempt to resist lockdown measures. But there is also in the next slides a lot of protest for worker rights. This is a protest, say, at the exit of the lockdown. This is Italy. Workers of a metallurgic factories protesting against the use that some business firms do of the crisis in order to attack labor workers. And this is protest that we have seen a lot since March when there was the lockdown. protest of precarious workers, protest of Amazon's workers. And since the lockdown was partial, that is, people continued to work, most of them offline, also the protests were accompanying the development of the crisis. The next slide, we also see that protests developed on issues that has been since the beginning very much related to the development of the pandemic. Pollution has increased, apparently, scientists said. The type of effects, killing effects of the pandemic. On the 24th of April, there was the 5th global strike by Fridays for Future, and the activists found innovative, creative ways to express their protest. This is in Berlin in front of the parliament. So if people couldn't go, they could leave their claims written down, and the protests were very much covered by the media. Other topics on which there was protest, as I show in the next slide. This is Athens, and this is May, the 1st of May demonstrations, showing how you can protest also in the after lockdown phase. So say protest with mask, but protest with social distancing, but still the feelings that citizens' rights are to be defended nowadays, and especially as the type of measures against the COVID have been used also by authoritarian states to reduce democratic rights. People have been protesting also against authoritarian turn and for democracy. And the last picture I wanted to show in the next slide, you see demonstrations in Ljubljana by progressive activists protesting against the way in which right-wing governments had tried to exploit the pandemic to restrict citizens' rights. So what we see here is that, as I synthesize in the next slide, you have a sort of new wave of protest and social movements. The expectations is that on all these topics, but also on other topics, violence against women, the conditions of the homeless, migrations, and so on, there are protests that tend to bridge very often these topics. So what we have is movements that act. And how do they act? They innovate on the type of protest repertoire, but they also intervene in forms of new mutualism, self-help, and so on. And especially they create a sort of alternative knowledge. In the next slides, I summarized a bit these protest repertoires in the different steps of the pandemic. So the lockdown, but also the post-lockdown. And what we have seen has been a lot of protest online. So from live streamed protest, digital rallies, virtual marches, online petitions. But also protest in constrained in the free space, which were limited free spaces which were available. So pot banging or collective performances, singing of protest songs from balcony. but also, for instance, in factories calling sick against the lack of precautions and extreme exploitations of this time. And when the lockdown started to be reduced, what we saw were also car caravans, bike caravans, walkouts, distance demos, as the ones I've shown, sit-ins. And we all along saw boycotts, strikes, rent strikes going on. So protest repertoires, as repertoires in Tilly's definitions, tend to change slowly, but to adapt to different conditions. And I think that online and offline, we have seen innovations through a very quick spreading of ideas from one country to the next, and exploiting this strong attention to a global mass media. But in the next step, and in the next slide, I also wanted to point at something that movements have done. Progressive movements have contributed a lot in this moment of crisis by doing things that they had done already in the past, but especially in moment of crisis, so also during the anti-austerity protests, they had developed forms of that have been called new mutualism, or direct social actions, or self-help type of activities. So distributions of food and medicines, productions of healthy food and medical equipments, the sheltering of the homeless people, or the categories more at risk. And in doing this, I think the movements have performed a very important function in a critical moment, that is creating ties, creating resilience, creating solidarity, that have been particularly important also as point of departure for a critique of the ways in which the type of world that have been created has been favoring the entering of this type of the consequences of the pandemic. So all these type of actions have been immediate, and have been constructed on existing networks, but have been also enriched by the development of new grassroots type of organization. And next, if you see a next way, and another important way, what that has been developing is through alternative type of knowledge. So knowledge productions, knowledge sharing, knowledge distribution that has been done by social movements that have been very active in developing and influencing the public debate. So in the next slide, what I want to stress is that usually social movement studies address organizational action repertoires, organizational forms and frames. I also tried to organize my thoughts in this way. And what I saw is that in terms of organizational forms, there was also this type of innovations that are related with networking in action. So there has been organizational appropriation through the reactivations of social movement organizations, but there has been also the emergence of new type of ties and groups that to a large extent, are already interacting, constructing networks in which the different frames have been bridged. And this one can see also in the next slide, related to the framing of the post-pandemic world. So the message of social movements has been the pandemic has been fueled by a world that was characterized by social inequalities that have made the pandemic all the more deadly. That was in a world in which nature had been disregarded to the extent that the environmental pollution has increased the lethality of the virus. Has been a world in particular in which public health has been reduced and health has been commodified, and privatization has been going on together with this commodification. So there has been a bridging, I think, of these different topics, but there has been also some innovations in the ways in which the problems have been seen. On the one hand, a more radical claim for change. So even more, I think that in the austerity crisis, what emerged nowadays is the urgency of deep type of changes that involved, on the one hand, a larger intervention by the public, but also not just the return to the old forms of welfare state, but rather a development of the idea of the commons. Health has been claimed as a common, and one of the main ideas related with the common is the fact that it is not something to be given top down by the states, but it is something that required the participations of the citizens. So next slide. What is the type of threats and opportunities for social movements in this moment? I think there is, of course, a lot of threats. Thinking about the amount of money that will be spent in for the development of the market, for the sort of for addressing economic problems. What is evident is that there is already a big competition by the greedy 1%. And it is evident that there is a growing inequalities, that the pandemic has been fueled by inequalities, and that's increased the inequalities itself. So there is an evidence of strong threats, and there is an evidence of different actors organizing to exploit the development in post-pandemic time. But there are also, I think, discursive opportunities. So what we see is that the mainstream discourse is the post-pandemic time cannot be similar to the pre-pandemic time. Of course, different actors mean different things by this statement. But what I think social movement can exploit is the perceptions that you need changes, and you need drastic and deep type of changes. So a question that is relevant is which are the political opportunities for this. And here I think that in the last 5 minutes, what we can reflect upon is the fact that the pandemic has been a turning point in the story of social movements, but also that it happened in a moment that was a moment of high mobilization. When I was in Lisbon in present the last time, some months ago, I presented a paper on the hot autumn of 2019, which was autumn was a term that was used 50 years ago to describe the revival of labor and student protest in Italy and then also all over in Europe. So 2019 was again a moment of high mobilization. And this pandemic is not, I think, for long interrupted this mobilization. In Hong Kong, like in Chile, in Barcelona or in Lebanon, all over in Latin America, but also in North Africa and in Europe, there were broad moments of protest. The Gilets jaunes in France were an example, but there was also, together with this, a sort of revival, renaissance of the left, of attention to issues of social justice and so on. So I think we were already living in a situation in which the political opportunities were opening up through the actions of previous waves of protest, like the anti-austerity protest that had in Spain, in Portugal, but also in Greece, in Italy, broad and important type of consequences. So in, I think, the last slide, I want to finish this presentation with the reflections about what movements can do in momentous time. I think that's, as I mentioned, these moments are moments of high conflicts because there are not only progressive social movements that want to exploit the momentum, but there are also very powerful actors that are trying to use the crisis for their own aims. What I think movements are doing for the progressive side nowadays is opening up critical junctures. So they're producing cracks. They have pointed through radical forms of actions, through very visible form of actions, produce sudden ruptures in the ways in which the problems were perceived and addressed. This has been vibrating is the term that I use in this article to stress the fact that these cracks, these ruptures have been reproducing themselves. And I think that this is a first development that can bring about the sedimenting, the stabilizations of the legacy of the ruptures in a transform, in deep transformations. Now, my dog is telling me that I talk too much and I stop here.
Wow, we are also interested in what you want to say. Well, thank you very much, Donatella. It was super interesting, and I was doing my best to. I was trying my best to reflect on what you were saying, and also reflect on on the comments that we are receiving. And I will start with some questions that I was collecting, and trying to synthesize them in a few words. So I think that there is a quite important point that Beatrice Padilla, that I want to say hi, mentioned is the fact that okay, we are now talking about progressive social movement, but in this moment they are also conservative or even far-right movement defending what they call their civil liberties. So the question is, Beatrice stressed that she's seen very different logics and scripts in the USA if compared with Europe and Latin America, and that far-right movements are only ones that break stay-home orders to challenge governors in the so-called liberate movement. So, but Olivier Filieux, that I also would like to say hi to, mentioned that, of course, that this is happening also in Europe in a certain way, in Germany or Spain. And Mariana Lira stressed that in Brazil is the same. So there are kind of counter movements also in this situation. There is a very emerging dynamic, let's say, of new issues. I would say on the part of previous cleavages that it looks to me that are strengthened, but in some of previous traits. And so I think that we would like to hear you a little bit about these points.
Yes, I think they are important questions. I pointed at the title that I wanted to talk about progressive movements because I know that there are many movements in this moment, but it is, I think, important also to look at the dynamics of backlash. And I think that we would need research on this because the first impressions that we can have from reading mainstream media as well as alternative type of coverage is that these are movements of a different types. They are often very well founded by the radical rights supporters. They are sponsored by party in government like the Republicans in the United States, and in Germany there are yes?
In Brazil too.
In Brazil, yes. So it's Bolsonaro and Trump that try to prompt their own supporters. This has been quite visible in the United States, where several of the protesters brought posters in support of Trump. In Germany, I think it's a bit of different stories, but the radical right with Alternative für Deutschland seems to be also involved. And it shows also some type of streams within the extreme rights of all these conspirative theories that have been developing. Of course, there are differences. In the United States, we have seen some of these people armed with gun machines. In Germany, they look more peaceful. My impression is that it's much smaller type of phenomenon in numbers, and but of course that we need to do research on this because they tell also us some of the contradictions within the radical right, some of the tensions, because on the one hand, what we saw in many countries is that the radical right was claiming authoritarian states. But at the same time, it was also one stream claiming instead individual freedom. And I think it's useful to investigate this empirically.
Mm-hmm. Thank you very much for your answer. And I have here another question by Danica Fink-Hafner. And she's referring to the role of mass media in the current social movements, and if we can consider at least part of mass media, which is the role of mass media in this moment for social movements, if we can consider them part of social movements or just channels to disseminating information. And I would like to add to this maybe if you can give some reflection about the role of new media, because maybe there, do you think that is their role with strength in this current situation because of the limitation of face-to-face activism? And so this is the point, the relation of media, let's say, with this.
Yes. Yes, this I think it's very important because it has been very important for all the type of activities that I've mentioned. So they have been important for protests, especially in the moments of the lockdown, because they had to adapt to conditions in which movements in the streets was not possible. But they have been also very important for knowledge constructions and distributions. So there has been a proliferation of different types of use of the mass media to collect information, also in order to oppose fake news, but also to share informations and to produce alternative visions. So this has been important, and they have been important for the organizations of new mutualism, direct social actions, and so on. So for all this type of networking. I think they have been also particularly important because all our life went online. So you said in the beginning, your seminar was usually offline and it went online. Our teaching went online. Our meetings with friends went online for a period, and because I think that now things are fortunately changing, and let's hope that it will be in a more open direction. But I think that also this, of course, had an impact. We all became much more knowledgeable about social media. There was a strengthening of the potentials about things to do online. So, of course, social movements have been also influenced by life going online in order to go online themselves. I think that's all the advantages and disadvantages from social media became more visible. So we have been permanently under an overload of information with a lot of difficulties in navigating in these massive proposals of information. Also because some of the challenges came from the fact that pandemic times also introduced, new topic for movement to address. So they could build upon their own alternative knowledge and constructions, but they had to learn a lot. So some the social media and the new media, but also all the media that we find online were particularly relevant in this type of development. In terms of types of communication, I think what we see in social media and in mainstream media is a focusing on monothematic coverage of the pandemic. So that's many other issues, if they were not directly linked, bridged to the pandemic, have been bracketed and put aside. And the other thing is not only it was monothematic, but it was also focusing on dramatic and dramatically negative type of events. This, I think, that also had an impact on the type of communication, highly emotional, and with the need of transforming emotion of despair and emotions of fears that is at the moment also very widespread into what is usually considered as a type of emotionally emotions which are more welcoming to mobilizations like hope and outrage. So I think that the social medias are very important, and that also the effect of these communications going online has been, on the one hand, extremely positive for movements, but on the other hand, still requires to pay attention to the challenges of the virtual world.
Yes, thank you. I like to mention in this respect to this some point that emerged in the past webinar about housing activism in the pandemic. And the challenges and difficulties also, because many people affected by the housing crisis also don't have opportunities to access an internet. So there is also a kind division and inequality in the access to new technology. So it can focus too much in this situation to social networks can also reproduce the inequalities of the origin. Maybe we can also reflect about this. And this can also introduce, I think, a little bit the next two questions are a little bit related to each other, and not by chance they come from the organizers of the conference you were mentioning before about social solidarity. No, I don't remember exactly, sorry, the title of the conference, but it was in this conference in Lisbon, and Anna Margherita Esteves is asking about the role of prefigurative politics in the current situation for social movements, and how the like social center runs soft kitchens and the health centers, urban gardens, solidarity economy and networks, etc. is developing now in this situation. And this is connected to Leonardo Leal's question about the role of solidarity actions and how new mutualism that you mentioned before and solidarity economy can improve and can introduce innovations in democracy. And I think that this can also a little bit be linked to something I was thinking before when you mentioned about, we were talking about the innovations in this current situation and from social movements. Okay, we are facing many innovations, and especially in framing and in the discourse. And of course, there are new opportunities also. I think that is a powerful instrument, the idea of how can you oblige people to stay home if they have terrible home conditions, terrible economical conditions, they cannot stay home. I think that the inequality and many social problems were so evident in the current crisis that for social movements in sometimes was very not, I cannot say simple, but the discourse was strengthened by this situation, and we could see, at least in Portugal, the opportunity to promote, push, let's say, the social movement's agenda in this situation in certain ways. So there is a room of opportunity to push certain discourses. On the other side, I like to know, also connecting to this question of Anna Margherita and Leonardo about prefigurative politics, social solidarity, mutualism, and what you mentioned before, the alternative knowledge, which is also, I think, is very important. I think if we are not just seeing these as these are not results of previous waves of mobilization since the global justice movement, so that without these previous experiences, we didn't have these resources now to face the situation. So which is the role of the past justice?
Yes.
I don't know if
I think
many things, but
there are many things, but they are connected. And I think, in fact, that's the fact that in part by contingency, this pandemic way emerged in a moment of high mobilization has helped a lot to transform what could have been anomic type of reactions into collective mobilizations. Of course, not all of them, because I still think that many people fear to go outside. Many people still live the shock of the pandemic. But I think the collective type of reactions in the world of labor, as in the environmental type of movements, have been very fast, and there's been very well organized, not top down, but rather horizontally. So people reorganized, doing things that they had learned to do during the anti-austerity protest, and this brought about also, I say, important continuities, because I stressed the momentum, but I think the momentum is also made of memories of the past, and is also made by the type of networks that re-emerge from the past. And the capacity to exploit this type of discursive opportunities that you have stressed now, and that's I'd mentioned in the presentation, I think is extremely relevant. It's one of the effects of the crisis that can be exploited by movements. Not always movements are successful, but a crisis means the thing cannot go ahead as they were until now. Changes is needed. Everyone at the moment recognizes this, even if the willingness to act on these reflections varies, and in some cases it is just a rhetorical type of attitudes, but it is a little bit like in the financial crisis, it is the perceptions that everything should change. Then with the financial crisis, what we saw was that not everything changed. Something changed, but something remained the same. Colin Crouch told of the strange non-disappearance of neoliberalism, given the strength of some interest. And I think these are all important challenges also now. But here I go to Anna Margherita and Leonardo's questions about prefigurations. I think that prefigurative activities were extremely important during the pandemic, in the sense that they, to a certain extent, the pandemic itself announced the need to live in different way. So it was a degrowth by crisis, which is not good, but it was also cognitive challenge to invent a different form of life, to recognize the increasing injustice of the most and most visible inequalities, to show how the consequences of the pandemic were all the most dramatic in comparative perspectives in the countries that had gone farther in neoliberal type of approaches. The United States is the nightmare for all. So it shows that institutions matters, but it also shows the importance of the actions of horizontal networks of individuals, and thinking about solidarity economy it seems to be one of the branches of the economy that has been, to a certain extent, booming during the pandemics, at least in terms of resonance of the message of healthy food produced in fair ways and so on, with the perceptions by the people that the type of massive production, the type of free trade promoted by the international organizations was part of the problems. And in fact, I think that from the triggering of activities of self-productions that build up also on knowledge that had developed with the community gardening or of the crisis. I think this has penetrated also a lot in these movements, creating opportunities that scholars are already studying for the development of solidarity economy.
Thank you for your answer. I think I will collect just more two questions and comments from the chat. There is a very difficult question that is so difficult for me that I even not sure if I'm able to synthesize it, but I will try. No, I'm quite kidding, but it's a very important point, I think, that is opened by João Terrenas. Is mentioning the fact that the pandemic, as well climate change issues and topic, is putting into discussion the anthropocentric perception of human activities and the social world, etc. And so, if we don't need a not human-centric perspective in social movements, if I was able to transmit the message, is this more or less the content? If we have to extend social movements to non-human being, let's say. Mm-hmm.
Yes. Well, it is in fact a difficult question, and I think it would require a conference of its own, because I see very much the point. It is true, and in fact, I think it is not something totally new. It has been part of the reflections of social movements, especially indigenous people, of movements for food sovereignties that have pointed at the importance to put also the nature at the center of the reflection. So I think that it is an important reflection that we need to do. And that's probably we need more cross-fertilizations between the mainstream social movement studies and especially reflections by post-colonialist type of thinking, also on the need to introduce nature more fully within our perspective. But, you should organize a next webinar on this.
Yeah, it's, I remember I was listening to this conference by John Dryzek about deliberative democracy and the connection with climate change issues, and they suggested that the connection between the two topics, the resolutions of the two problems can only be taking the two problems together. So the solution for democracy problems and climate change problems can just taken together, let's say. So maybe this is also something we can reflect. Here we have a comment related to this by Carla Pereira, and she tried to answer to João Terena, saying that non-human beings actually are included in social movements, because a lot of reflection of social movement studies and social movements in themselves is around justice, and justice is a non-anthropocentric approach. So in a certain way, we can see that social movements, maybe they already have studies, they already have inside the answer to this challenge, according to this perspective. Sorry, there are many questions. So here we have a question by Massimiliano Andretta. Hi, Massimiliano. He asking, Donatella, don't you think that right-wing and conservative movements will have more political and discursive opportunities for their agenda than progressive ones? In putting their agenda forward by stressing the need for more authoritative control of the population, restrictive policies for collective actions, anti-migrant sentiments, well, all the components of right-wing thinking that we know very well. So they are not more consistent with the current crisis than the component of left-wing discourse. This is the question by Massimo.
Yes, of course, no one is the right answer, and it is true that fear can be exploited and are exploited a lot by right-wing movements and by right-wing governments. So Trump is, for instance, using the pandemic to close the borders, and actors on the radical right have been scapegoating migrants or poor people in general as responsible for spreading the virus. There have been also during the pandemic a sort of tendency to call for authoritarian type of intervention. On the other hand, I think that there are serious challenges for the radical right. First of all the anti-scientific type of discourses that the radical right has promoted. Think about Trump and his attitude towards science has been are now not at all resonance with the mainstream discursive trends, that to the contrary seems to be more oriented towards trusting science even too much than towards mistrusting science. Also, I think that in these moments the perceptions has increased that social inequalities have developed to such an extent that their consequences are really literally killing. So Goran Taborn had written a book, The Killing Fields of Inequalities. And I think it has never been more resonant, this title, than nowadays. And so I think that's discourses in terms of also immorality of capitalism can have resonance nowadays as they had during the austerity type of crisis. The radical right has been very much negationist towards climate change. And I think that nowadays instead there is a very widespread understanding that the pollution and sickness of different types have been sort of related to each other. So I think that many of the arguments of the radical rights has been undermined by the development during the pandemic. There has been also another type of development. I think that what we see is that people realize that privatizations of public services, first of all, public health, has the most dramatic consequences. That the market is unable to survive any type of pandemic without a big influx of public capital. And what we see is also that there are actors that are mobilizing this. So the trade unions, in the health system, also horizontal networks of people are organizing and putting forward this discourse. So I don't think that the radical right is, say, radically and unavoidable undermined, but I think that there are in the pandemic a lot of discursive opportunities for the left and discursive challenges for the radical right. And in fact, what we see nowadays is that the protest of the radical rights in Europe are quite marginal in comparison with the voices coming from the left. But of course, it's a struggle that has to be carried out.
Thank you, Donatella. I just have I think I will collect the last question. I think is quite important, but it comes from Luana Taborda, and she is asking she's asking about the possible cleavage between the protection of health and protection of work. There is no the risk to that this dilemma, let's say, could open all the cleavages that we already knew in respect to the protection of environment and protection of the work, and that was in the past divided social movements like labor movements and environmental movements. So if this is not potentially weakness, let's say, this dilemma, this
Yes, of course, there is a tension, I think it's true. But what we have seen we are just starting a research on the protest with a special focus on protest on health and protest on labor issues. And what we have seen is that during the pandemic, many of the protests for health, for public health, came from workers. So came from Amazon workers that wanted to be protected during their work, came from the workers in the sectors that continued to function even during the lockdown, that were asking for protective measures, came from the workers in the public health system. And they were very vocal, and they continue to be vocal. So many of the protests that we are collecting are protests by nurses, doctors that said a couple of weeks ago, we were the heroes. Now you have to listen to us. And what they say, what they propose are ways to combine security on the work, to combine the development of less polluting type of products with the, so combine health and work, combine environment and labor issues. This is also, I think, something that, of course, is challenged. Is something that needs to be constructed, but not by chance. During the pandemic, we saw also a remobilizations of positions that have been defended by those progressive organizations that were active on issues of public health, from the social clinics to the Marea Blancas, to Medicina Democratica, to Doctors Without Borders. I think there is knowledge and there are cognitive instruments that can show the potentials that come from bridging health rights and labor rights.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thank you. This is
I hope at least.
It's very interesting. I'm really looking forward to see the results of these collections of protest events during the pandemic time. I think it's a very interesting analysis that we should do, and I think that is. I would like to discuss much more with you all and collect more questions. But I think we are arriving at the end of our seminar. It was really interesting. Thank you very much, Donatella, for being here and for accepting this invitation. I hope we will have the opportunity to have more seminars face to face in very soon. And for now we finish here, and we will have the video of the presentation and of the session of today available on YouTube on the ISCTE channel by tomorrow, I think, and I will send also information about the next sessions in the future. But for now, thank you very much. It was very nice to have you here. Super interesting. Thank you.
Thank you, Gaia. Thank you too. I've seen names of old friends, and I've seen names of new friends among the participants. Yeah. And I also wanted to thank you, all of you, for participating.
Yeah, that's super. That's great also for me to see all the friends connected. That's very, very nice. This is, I think, that is one of the few advantages of this situation, that we can really meet with people that we don't used to meet usually in the day by day. So I think it's a very good opportunity, this one. And thank you. So have a nice afternoon or day if you are in other part of the world. And bye-bye and take care.
Bye. Bye. Thank you.